Todo married his idol, Dabura has been confirmed to be stronger than Gojo or Sukuna, and Megami is dead. At least in our hearts. Yeah, you probably thought we were done with Majulo content, but boy oh boy, are we not. See, because just yesterday, April 27th, it was revealed at a Shonen Jump event that with the release of Volume 3 of Majulo, that being the third and final volume of Majulo, we would be receiving additional content in the form of an extra chapter. Similar to how with the final volume of JJK, we got an additional chapter that showed us what Panda, Nobara, Yuji, and Urame were up to. And while that final volume isn't slated to release for a while now, with an official release date in May, leakers already got their hands on it. And while the extra chapter is only 4 pages long, tells us not only how a fan favorite character is doing, but also what he's been up to. We were given a slew of additional drawings and renderings of characters from Majulo. We have official statements from both Gege Akutami and Yuji Iwasaki, the artist of Majulo. We also got an update about how powerful the Maharaga we saw in Majulo was, and some wrap-up information about a myriad of characters that we saw in Majulo. All that is to say, there is a ton to dive into today. So with no further ado, let's dive directly into Todo has returned. But before we get to dipping into Majulo for one last time, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you guys are looking for one additional Nick video every single week, you can find 70 Naruto reaction episodes using the fourth wall link in my description below. But before we get into all that, today I want to talk to you about the sponsor of today's video, Girls Frontline 2 Exilium. It's a 3D strategy RPG for both mobile devices and PC that focuses around the collection and customization of dolls. And all of those dolls' weapons are customizable with a 3D customization weapon system in this universe. And once you've customized these dolls' weapons, you can customize the dolls themselves. But why join the Girls Frontline 2 team right now? Well, because they just dropped a brand new doll and weapon. See, Gentle Helen, a core member of the Freeze team, is bursting onto the scene, and her strong insight and protective instincts make her a must on any team. Because while she may seem gentle on the exterior, she becomes the backbone of any team that she's added to. See, Helen is a Bulwark class doll who can take the damage for the team and shield her allies. But she's also able to buff other members of the Freeze team. Members like Alva and Robella. But she's not always focused on defense, because Helen comes with her very own shotgun, the dual set defender. Based on the SG-12, its incredible ammo capacity and firepower make it incredible for both offense and defense. But that's not all. Helen is also dropping with a limited time outfit, which will be available for a limited time discount between April 23rd and May 13th. And this outfit comes with a full set of independent skill effects, along with swappable outfit accessories. On top of this, from April 23rd to May 13th, Dushevnia will get her first outfit, and it will be available for a limited time discount. This outfit will come with swappable accessories, multiple styles, including sporty and swimwear themes, making it so once you obtain these accessories, it's basically like having multiple outfits. And the real cherry on top is that after the April 23rd update, Leva's new outfit, Sultry Tempo, will be added to outfit procurement. This outfit will also come with swappable accessories, and by obtaining this outfit, it will unlock brand new interactive story scenes. And simply by participating in events and claiming reward mail, players can obtain 30+ outfit access permissions to help unlock Leva's outfit. So what are you waiting for? Join the theme event going on right now, Starlight Gala, to obtain the item to unlock Helen's interactive story scene and furniture pieces, all for free. You can also join the themed event to obtain 90+ pulls and 9,000+ collapse pieces. So what are you waiting for? Download Girls Frontline 2 today using the link in my description. Playing with dolls has never been so cool. So there's a lot to get into, and a lot of the information is relatively disjointed and non-connected. Like I said, we got a bunch of different renderings of different characters from Majulo, and that's fun additional artwork. We have a 4-page extra chapter that focuses around Todo and Miyaguni. We have official statements from both the author and the artist of Majulo, and some wrap-up info that was roughly translated from the volume itself. And that's where I want to start, because this info is about basically everybody from Majulo as a story. Now, I'm not entirely sure how this info was packaged. I don't know if there was additional pages or additional chapters that are being text leaked right now, or if there was some kind of SBS where either Gege or Yuji were answering questions about the story that led us to getting this information in the first place. All I have right now is info that is supposedly a rough translation of info that was given in this 3rd volume. And the first bit of info from that dump is the fact that Yuji and Miyaguni are related in a mentorship kind of way. See, Miyaguni, the double buns lady who sat on the Jujutsu Council, was a big conversational point in the Majulo fandom because everybody was trying to figure out who she was related to. And unfortunately, because manga is black and white, it was kind of hard to tell who her genetic heritage could be drawn back to. With people hypothesizing that maybe Yuji was her father, or maybe Megumi was her father, with some even going so far as to say his Gojo was her father. And this entire conversation kind of revolved around what color Miyagune's hair would be. And when she did eventually get rendered in color, it was revealed that her hair was blonde. And thus people came to the conclusion that clearly she must be the child of Hana and Megumi, because Hana is blonde. But nothing along those lines has ever necessarily been confirmed. However, what was confirmed in not only this info dump, but also in the additional chapter that we were given, is that Miyagune was mentored not only by Yuji, but also by Todo, which is a pretty crazy roster of teachers to have. We were then told something that we all knew, which is the fact that Wee Wee was the new head of the new Shadow Style school, something that was easily confirmable with her own eyes, even though Wee Wee was cosplaying as Mei Mei in Majulo. However, apparently Wee Wee has adopted the practice of leeching the life force from new Shadow Style school members to extend his life so he can continue spreading the gospel of Mei Mei. Essentially, Wee Wee is trying to achieve immortality so he can spend that infinite lifetime telling everybody about how great his older sister was. Or maybe still is. There's no confirmation as to whether or not Mei Mei is alive or dead, but it's safe to assume, since Wee Wee is in his 80s, that Mei Mei is probably dead. Speaking of old women, it was also told to us that Nobara used to visit Panda. However, when she would make her way to the Gojo storehouse, most of the time she would find Panda not working. And this is a point that's been discussed basically every time we've seen Panda from the ending of JJK on. Since Panda had the vast majority of his cores destroyed during the Culling Games, he entered into a broken down state, where only on good days where he was feeling sturdy could he hold anything resembling a conversation. However, this is probably why Yuji scooped up Panda from the Gojo clan storehouse to go and try and apologize to Nobara for falling out of her life. All that is to say is that Nobara has a soft spot in her heart for Panda, which gives some more credence to Yuji's plan of using Panda to try and diffuse the tension of the situation of seeing her again. Now, as for Nobara, we are also told that she spends the majority of her elderly years hanging out in Kyoto with her stray cat, who apparently hates Yuji. We then, rather interestingly, got an update about Mifuyo, who is Tsurugi and Yuka's mother. Though a relatively non-important character in Majulo, she is displayed as being a relatively stern and cold parent. A cold and stern parent who softens up on her children by the end of the story, but still a hard-nosed mother. And we learned that apparently the reason that Mifuyo ended up as this stern mother is because when Iori, her husband, and Tsuruga and Yuka's father, not the same Iori from the Culling Games, left the Gojo clan in order to find Yuji, she thought that she would face hardship. She thought the Gojo clan would reject her, as her husband did. But in actuality, the heads of the clan, that being Yuta and Maki, were incredibly kind to her, and even kinder to her children, Tsurugi and Yuka. However, on account of the fact that they were spoiled by the grandparents, Mifuyo tried to cancel out that spoiling by being stern. However, she admits that she overcorrected, and unfortunately it turned her into a cold mother. Now, as for Iori, he was specifically drawn to look exactly like Yuta. However, while he had Yuta's face and Yuta's body, he didn't have Yuta's kindness. And even though he dedicated his life to hunting down Yuji was eventually able to shake him off. And the last time that Iori was ever spotted was in the Tokyo abandoned zone, implying that Iori was most likely killed by cursed spirits in Tokyo while trying to find Yuji. And that's all of the roughly translated text information we got from Volume 3. So with that out of the way, let's get to talking about something very interesting that Gege said about Maharaga. See, because rather interestingly and seemingly with no prompt whatsoever, Gege put to bed something that JJK fans have been arguing now about for months. See, because Gege supposedly in information that came out alongside Volume 3 stated there was no difference in power between the respective Maharaga belonging to Megumi, Sukuna, and Yuka. However, due to the prolonged nature of the battle, Yuka's Maharaga ultimately emerged as the strongest of the three. And that is interesting. Essentially, what Gege is saying here is that every single time that Maharaga is summoned, he starts at the same level of power. So when Megumi summons Maharaga to fight against Haruta, when Sukuna summons Maharaga to fight against Gojo, and when Yuka summons Maharaga to fight against Dabura, all three of those Maharagas are equal in strength. Now, this is interesting because one of the biggest talking points surrounding Maharaga was, does Maharaga stay adapted to the things that it adapted to over the course of its previous fights? If Maharaga becomes immune to slashing attacks because of its battle against Sukuna, does it always hold on to that immunity? Or does it only hold on to that immunity while it's contracted to the same 10 Shadows user? That is, say, do we see a restart in Maharaga's adaptations every single time Maharaga goes to a new 10 Shadows user? And while we still can't say as to whether or not Maharaga holds on to the adaptations that it gains if it's summoned twice by the same user, seemingly what has now been solidified as a fact is the fact that Maharaga resets every single time it goes to a new 10 Shadow style user. So that means that the Maharaga defeated by Sukuna when Megami summoned it to battle against Haruta is as powerful as the Maharaga who was defeated by Sukuna in order to tame Maharaga, and then when Maharaga was summoned later by Sukuna to battle against Gojo, that Maharaga was as powerful as all the other Maharagas we had seen before. And the same thing can be said for Yuka. So what does that mean for the people that fought against Maharaga? I mean, 15 Finger Sukuna, Gojo, and Dabura all found themselves successful in combat against Maharaga. And technically, Sukuna did it twice. However, what's seemingly being implied here by Gege is that because Dabura and Maharaga's fight was the longest out of any of Maharaga's fights, which seems almost hard to believe on account of the fact that Maharaga versus Sukuna's fight in Season 2 and Maharaga's fight against Gojo were relatively long fights, that what Dabura pulled off was technically the most impressive. And that makes sense. I mean, think about what Maharaga was adapting to in its fight against Sukuna, slashing attacks. And inevitably, upon realizing that Maharaga was adapting to slashing attacks in general, Sukuna takes it out with a Fuga. And in Maharaga's battle against Gojo, Maharaga was adapted not only to the Infinite Void, but also Infinity. And so before it was able to accomplish either of those things, Gojo took it out with a maximum powered purple. Now, adapting to the Infinite Void, Infinity, or even slashing attacks in general is very impressive. And obviously, that would up Maharaga's strength. However, in the battle against Dabura, Maharaga had to adapt to the speed of light. See, not only did Maharaga adapt to Dabura's light-based attacks, but also Maharaga had to adapt to Dabura moving his body at approaching the speed of light, and the impacts of the blows that are attached to somebody moving at approaching the speed of light. And thus, not only was the battle between Maharaga and Dabura the longest, apparently, out of all of Maharaga's fights, but also this Maharaga was adapting to the highest level things that Maharaga's ever been forced to adapt to. And therefore, well, yes, the argument could be made that we see renditions of Sukuna stronger than the Sukuna that defeated his Maharaga. What seems to be being told to us, and rather plain writing here, is that Dabura is stronger than Gojo and Sukuna. Oh, but Gojo is fighting against Agito, Maharaga, and Sukuna all simultaneously. And you're right, it is a tough metric to use. Gojo wasn't fighting one-on-one. Sukuna wasn't in his strongest form yet. But if we're being entirely real with ourselves, neither was Dabura. We didn't even get to see what Dabura's domain expansion does. So to me, this is kind of just a passive-aggressive way of confirming what I've been saying for a long time, which is that the scaling of Majulo far outclasses anything we see in JJK. That's confirmed by Yuji's offensive firepower, the speed of Dabura, and Maharaga's ability to adapt to it. Now, with that said, I think I've either been kicked out of the Jujutsu Folk Discord for some reason, or it's been shut down, so I have to quickly find all my info somewhere else. Well, with that out of the way, let's get to the official statements from Yuji Iwasaki and Gege Akutami about the wrapping up of this project. Now, both of their statements are relatively long, and they're basically just them both being like, thank you so much for loving our 6-month project. However, there is one thing from the Yuji Iwasaki thank you note that I do want to talk about, and that'd be his 4th paragraph, where he says, even if you don't understand, even if you feel anxious, you have to give it a try, talking about working with Gege Akutami. Once I decided to take on the project, the pairing of Akutami-sensei and myself, a combination that at first glance seemed light years apart, began to strike me as strangely intriguing. If this goes well, wouldn't it make it easier for Jujutsu Kaisen to explore various storylines in the future? Now that part right there, that last sentence, has my ears perked. See, because while we actually do already have confirmation of additional spin-offs from the JJK universe, most notably a series of spin-off novels from the accredited horror author in Japan by the name of Yumaaki Hirayama, who's best known for the works like Diner, Cursed, and Tokyo Psycho, which are all horror dark fiction novels. Now, when I say novel, I don't mean manga. I mean books. Like, there is going to be book spin-offs of the JJK universe that are undoubtedly going to focus on the more literary, horror-focused aspects of the JJK world. However, even though these spin-off novels are going to be penned by Hirayama, they will, like with most light novels, be supervised by Gege. And while these novels were confirmed in September 2025, around when Majulo first started coming out, we haven't really heard anything else about them since they were announced. But books take a while to make, and they don't come out weekly. But this note from Iwasaki that refers to additional JJK spin-offs, or various storylines that could possibly be revealed in the future, kind of makes me believe that these novels may not be the only spin spin-offs of the JJK world that we have coming in our future, especially considering how vastly popular Majulo was. And thus on account of the fact that relatively Majulo was able to stick the landing of a spin-off manga in the JJK universe, not only is there a positive indication that this can be done and the fans will like it, but also there's the monetary side to take into consideration as well. Majulo sold a lot of copies of manga. Financially, it was a great decision. Thus, moving forward, it seems as though Iwasaki is trying to tell us that Majulo has set the benchmark for what a spin-off in the JJK universe can look like, and that seemingly there's fundamentally no reason for more not to exist. On top of this, Gege's final note about Majulo was much more positive than his final note about JJK, as he spent his 5-paragraph thank you note talking about how many happy accidents happened over the course of the production of Majulo. Talking about how useful and perfect his new editor, Fukuda-san, was. He talking about the necessity to bring in Iwasaki because he feared that if he were to draw more characters from the Majulo universe, they would just end up looking like characters from the JJK universe, and how even with that caveat, Iwasaki far surpassed everything he dreamed of for the art of Majulo, saying that Iwasaki performed at 120% of his expectations. He then went on to talk about how the Smiria arc, that being Chapter 8 and Chapter 9, was influenced by a man of Tetsu Nakamura, who dedicated his life to charity work and medical activities in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and how even after his work was carried on by those he inspired. One of those people being Gege Akutami, apparently. Which brought us to the final paragraph of Gege's thank you note, where he says, maybe rather concerningly, I believe that anyone can have feelings of discrimination or sadistic urges well up from their smallest triggers. There might come a time when I myself am governed by those impulses. No matter how immature it may be, I am proud to have drawn the work called Majulo as a final guidepost before losing myself. Now, there's a couple of ways to interpret this message. Obviously, we are all aware of the fact that JJK's ending did not go well for Gege Akutami. The entire internet was relatively outraged with how JJK came to its close. And we'd be lying to ourselves if we didn't acknowledge the fact that Majulo was definitely at least partially made so that Gege could try to correct at least a couple of the complaints that people had about the ending of JJK. But what Gege is essentially saying to us here is that even though some may find it immature of him to have pride in the fact that he was the one who wrote the story of Majulo, he's happy he did it. He calls it his final guidepost before losing himself. So it seems as though if you read this optimistically, that Gege is essentially saying that the backlash of the ending of JJK kind of sent him into a downward spiral. A downward spiral that could have caused him to lose himself if not for the penning of Majulo. In fact, if you're reading this optimistically, which I'm choosing to do, essentially what Gege is saying here is that Majulo saved him. And listen, there were a fair amount of you that did not like the ending of Majulo. I'm not one of them. I've said multiple times that I quite liked the ending of Majulo, but listen, there was a lot of you. But it seems as though the public reception to Majulo, and maybe more importantly, the public reception to the ending of Majulo, was better than the public reception to the ending of JJK. And thus, between Iwasaki and Akutami's final notes to all of the fans of Majulo, it seems as though not only was Iwasaki saying that Majulo has paved the way for more JJK spin-offs, but it seems as though Gege is also saying that Majulo helped him out of a funk. And thus, if you read both of those statements optimistically, it seems as though a path has been cleared to the world where more JJK spin-offs are on the horizon. Whether those be stories about Kashimo or Sukuna and Urame's life in the Heian era, there's a huge capacity within the confines of the JJK universe for additional spin-offs. And the success of Majulo has seemingly juiced those numbers. But enough with all of the filler content, Nick. What happened in the extra chapter? Well, let's get into it. The chapter opens with Crossmaru, Yuka, and Tsurugi all sitting around on a couch, as Tsurugi looks at his wrist tablet thing and says, "Vibraslap? What is that?" And to answer his question, Yuka makes a motion with her fist in hand like this and goes, you know, the instrument that goes kran. And in response to this, Tsurugi sighs as he goes, is there a music store around here? But Yuka tells him this is the kind of thing that you probably want to order online. I mean, who's selling a Vibraslap? But apparently Tsurugi needs this Vibraslap today, so ordering it online isn't an option. And apparently the reason he needs it today is because Miyaguni has requested that he finds one and gives it to her old master today. And that puts a smile on Yuka's face, because apparently she loves seeing Tsurugi bossed around by Miyaguni, who we then cut to holding a Vibraslap. Miyaguni, with a light smile on her face, says, sorry, my master asked for it, you see. He's coming back to Japan for the first time in a long time. Now, obviously here we're talking about Todo. He's the only person in the entirety of the JJK universe who has any semblance of a connection to the Vibra Slap, because after losing his hand in the battle against Mahito, he made a binding vow with himself that he'd only be able to channel his Boogie Woogie through a Vibra Slap. Now, ultimately, that wasn't a disadvantage at all, as it literally allowed for him to be able to use Boogie Woogie something like 50 times a second. The real interesting takeaway from this first page, however, is A, the fact that it's being revealed that Miyaguni trained under Todo, and B, the fact that Todo has been out of Japan for a long time now. Now, as to what Todo was doing outside of Japan, we don't know, and we don't find out over the course of this chapter. However, we do know the reason that Todo is returning to Japan, and that's because Yuji, Nobara, and Todo all need to work on essentially creating an army of heavenly restriction users in Japan who are going to fight against the few cursed spirits that are still going to pop up, even now that cursed energy has been eliminated. And to do that, for some reason, they need Todo. Presumably to get to the heavenly restriction users faster? I don't know. At the very least, it's been established that Todo is essential for making a plan to make sure that Japan is going to be covered in the event of a cursed spirit coming along, even after Yuji is dead. Now, upon hearing that Todo is Miyaguni's master, Tsurugi begins to question her, going, "Master? Not a teacher?" But Miyaguni lets him know that Todo isn't her new Shadow Style School teacher, but rather her jujitsu master. That is to say, the person that taught her all of her jujitsu techniques. Now, what's also being revealed here is that Miyaguni is a member of the new Shadow Style School. And we actually learned from the additional artwork that was dropped with Volume 3 that Miyaguni is the person who taught Tsurugi new Shadow Style School techniques. Because if you'll remember, in Tsurugi's battle against Maru, he uses a new Shadow Style technique, similar to the one that Miwa used, but better and useful. Anyways, Tsurugi goes on to say, "Oh, this is the first time I've ever heard of him," which leads to Miyaguni sighing as she says, "At my age, you forget what you've told the who." At which point, Tsurugi thinks about asking her how old she is, but rather intelligently decides not to. But Miyaguni begins to reflect on her time with Todo. She says, "Well, the time that I spent studying under him wasn't all that long. He was, after all, an exceptionally devoted husband." Meaning that essentially Todo didn't have time to train Miyaguni in the way that he should have because he was spending too much time doting on his wife. And if you'll remember, one very important aspect of Todo's character is not only that he was very singularly focused on women and the kinds of women that his friends were into, but also Todo was obsessed with one woman in particular, specifically an idol by the name of Takeda. He would hallucinate cheering him on whenever he needed to be pushed over the edge. But did Todo end up marrying Takeda? Well, we'll talk about that in a second. Miyaguni, while talking about the time that she spent with Todo, undergoes a flashback where we see a younger version of her, where someone, most likely Todo, is telling her, "Chio, you are truly ruthless. You're well suited to be a jujitsu sorcerer. But battle does not exist simply for you to manifest your curses. Don't forget that." Now, there's a lot to unpack here because seemingly in this flashback, Miyaguni is in something akin to a prison. She has blood on her shirt and somebody is telling her that battle exists for more reasons than to just manifest her curses. But let's unpack that. What does manifesting her curses mean? Well, it can mean a lot of things. See, because we're not saying cursed spirits or cursed techniques. It's just curses, which is interesting because curses do exist in the JJK world. I mean, after all, it was a curse that made Rika. She is a vengeful cursed spirit because her death was cursed by Yuta. And thus what could be being said here, if it's not an incorrect translation, is that Miyaguni is a curse user, not a curse speech user, not a curse technique user, not a curse spirit user, a curse user. Kind of like a witch. Like she has some ability to hex people. However, unfortunately, on account of the fact that we never see Miyaguni in anything even close to action, we really have no idea what she does. And while I don't know if we'll ever get more information about how her individual curse techniques work, the idea of her being some kind of curse user is really intriguing to me. We then cut to the next page where seemingly Miyaguni is still reminiscing about what was told to her as a child, but now what we're being told is overlaid, a nub of a hand with a Vibra Slap stabbed into it, as Miyaguni continues to reflect on the lesson told to her by Todo, as he says, "Because of love, there is fear. Because of love, there is anger. And therefore, because of love, we fight. Because before we are jujitsu sorcerers, we are first and foremost humans." And it's at this point that we see what is seemingly Todo sitting on top of a sand dune, as Miyaguni thinks he's a fascinating person. We then, on the fourth and final page, finally get to see the 80-plus-year-old Todo, sporting a long beard and a flowing ponytail, his scar over his left eye still ever present. And after staring at the horizon, he looks over his shoulder and says, can you still walk? Seemingly to a woman with 2 ponytails following him through the desert. And in response to Todo's question, she simply says, "Don't go treating me like an old woman, dear." And thus Todo gets up and walks alongside her as he laughs and says, "My apologies, my wife," as the 2 of them walk off into the desert. But where are they going? And who is this wife? And what were they doing before this? Well, unfortunately, we don't have concrete answers to any of those 3 questions. Based on the fact that we know that Todo seemingly loves his wife more than anything on Earth, and based on the fact that she has 2 ponytails exactly like Takeda, the idol he was so obsessed with, it's not crazy to assume that eventually Todo got everything he ever hoped for, and married the idol he had spent years hallucinating about in the first place. A real Hailey Bieber, if you shall. Now, as for where they were or what they were doing, it's hard to say. However, it's important to note that Gege openly admitted that he based Chapter 8 and 9 off a legendary Japanese humanitarian who spent the majority of his life in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And thus, considering the fact that this old man Todo does not have his Vibroslap, meaning that he most likely isn't fighting anybody wherever he is, it's not crazy for us to assume that Todo and his presumed ex-idol wife spent the majority of their life in some deserty part of the world doing humanitarian work. And thus the reason that Todo needs a Vibroslap once he returns to Japan is because his humanitarian efforts are over and now he has to focus on setting up Japan for a future where sorcerers won't be around to fight against cursed spirits. However, all of that is just speculation based off all of the information we were given in Volume 3. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. What do you think Todo was up to? What do you think he's gonna go do in Japan? And how do you feel about all of this additional information? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm so hungry. Oh, and Megumi's dead because a lot of people thought the additional chapter was going to be about him. Also, there is a panel floating around of Megumi's grave, but we don't know if that's fake. You can never know with Megumi haters.